Okay, well, I'm just going to start. My name is Ben Zeidman. This is my thesis presentation. It's going to be an econometric evaluation of Trackman technology and new information's role in the pitching labor market of Major League Baseball. The reason that I really want to do this is, actually, it's the industry that I really want to work in. Hopefully the end goal is that I end up working in salary arbitration in this exact industry. So this is particularly interesting to me, but also there's just some things that you can do within the sports labor market that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So when you read the title, a very normal question for you to probably ask yourself is, what is Trackman? Trackman is the brand name Doppler radar system that was implemented in conjunction with Major League Baseball at the start of the 2011 season. The technology has been around for a while, but it was never actually used in game. And then it measures very specific in-game events, so it's able to measure exit velocities off the bat, player sprint speeds, spin rate of the baseball, more accurate velocities, just a bunch of stuff that basically us as fans, we never had access to. And even the decision makers within the game, they only had access to in laboratory conditions. This data became publicly available to fans beginning in the 2015 season through something called StatCast. It was available in the industry all the way back to 2011. So there is sort of a little bit of an information gap here where the teams had access to the information that we don't have and still don't have. So that's what Trackman is. I want to briefly talk about why using baseball as this market to test our economic assumptions is, maybe a good thing. There's a really nice paper by Lawrence Kahn that I sort of used as a foundational research for this whole research when I first thought of it 4 years ago. He does say, at a minimum, sports labor markets can be seen as a laboratory for observing whether economic propositions at least have a chance of being true. That's because this market, there are so many people within the market that are paid to be highly informed, as perfectly informed as possible, and to be highly competitive with the other teams. So this market should be approaching perfect competition in theory. It should be as close to perfectly informed and perfectly competitive as you can get. And now what we're doing is we're sort of evaluating the impact of this brand new information that's being just dumped on all of these people. There is a perfect competition wage taking assumption that I'm going to sort of ask us to make together. This is economics. We make a lot of fairly restrictive assumptions here. This is an institutional economic sort of thing, and I go over the nuances of institutional versus classical in the paper, but I don't think it's strictly necessary here. So I'm going to ask you to make an assumption with me, and that is that employers will pay up to the marginal revenue product for the labor. In other words, the employers in this market are wage takers. So then that leads to the fairly natural question of, well, is the market actually perfectly competitive? This is a big part of my literature review, and I'm going to briefly go over it. Gerald Scully in 1974 wrote a paper. This was before the invention of free agency or anything else. He basically said that monopsonic wage suppression leads to just this huge gap between wages and marginal product of revenue. Monopsony is basically defined as the cartel behavior that Miles was explaining in his paper as well. Owners are able to collude behind closed doors and artificially restrict the players' salaries. So players received on average 11% of their gross NPR and 20% of the net, which is just a ridiculous gap that did sort of start to get fixed as the years went on. Scully did a follow-up study in 1989. This is sort of confirmed and collaborated by McDonald's and Revell in 1994. Free agency and salary arbitration led to basically players began to be paid their expected net contribution to club revenues. There is some discrepancy about that. There's a lot of nuance that they put in the paper, and that's important because future studies do not agree, including this Berry and Schmidt paper. If you think about it sort of economically as well as logically, if all of these players are being paid expected to their net contribution to the club revenue, that means that the teams with the highest payroll will always win the most. That's not true at all, and Berry and Schmidt found that in the early 2000s. They found that the league is more competitively balanced at the end of the 20th century than at any previous time in its existence. It's important to note here that competitive balance in this case is not the same as economic efficiency. Competitive balance talks about wins and losses, and so basically if New York and Los Angeles are somehow losing a bunch of games despite having the league's highest payroll, obviously there's some sort of economic efficiency in there where these small market teams are finding ways to win games. So how do we go about detailing how these small market teams are managing to do this. John Hanks and Raymond Sauer's papers were really helpful with this, and actually when I initially started this project, what I was going to do was replicate this 2006 economic evaluation of the Moneyball hypothesis. Ended up not doing that, but it is a really good paper and refreshingly definitive. Basically, it details Oakland's appropriate valuation of the metric on base percentage. If you know what Moneyball is, you're going to know what I'm talking about. If you're not, it's a cool movie. It has Jonah Hill and Brad Pitt in it. It's pretty awesome. But so Oakland in the early 2000s basically found a labor market failure, capitalized on it. Nobody was valuing on base percentage to the proper degree that it impacted wins on the game. Oakland found it, knew it, and took advantage. John Hanks and Raymond Sauer say that baseball's labor market was inefficient at the turn of the 21st century because of this mispricing of skill, and it had been present for a while, perhaps even decades. Additionally, in follow-up research, they talk about the frontier, and they say that basically the market had corrected itself within 4 years. So that's super rapid. They found the labor market failure. They found Oakland was capitalizing. Everybody else caught on within 4 years. I think that speaks to the perfect competition sort of wage-taking assumption in this market. Once information is discovered, it's grabbed onto and it's corrected. So my research question is basically, all else equal, is yearly compensation for this labor in this market informed by these new Trackman metrics? Is it informed more than the traditional metrics that we've been using, and is it informed at all? If it is informed, can we capture the effects of this new Moneyball by some of these advanced metrics? Can we sort of replicate on base percentages labor market failure, and then isolate that, find it, and find a frontier for payroll efficiency by looking at these advanced, and generally Trackman uses physics to measure parts of the game. Here's how I collected my data. This is an example of some of the observations within my Excel spreadsheet. I have 316 observations of labor spanning from 2015 to 2019. The reason I chose these years is because it was implemented in 2015, so it didn't exist before then. I didn't include 2020 because it was a shortened season where a lot of things were different. And in 2021, they actually switched to a new system called Hawkeye. It's no longer Trackman. It still measures the same things, but it does so in different ways. So I'm using these 5 years of data, and I used only qualified starting pitchers who possess a four-seam fastball measured in rotations per minute. Qualified means that they pitched 162 innings in a player season. I use this number, it's not arbitrary, because that is the number that is considered within the industry as a full season. You're not eligible for end of season awards unless you meet this threshold as a starting pitcher. So this is a full season of player labor. Everybody has a four-seam fastball because I'm very interested in the spin rate of that fastball. So here are just some initial plots to talk about spin rate and compensation. There is something of a positive relationship. It's not super clear. More than anything, what I want to draw attention to is there's only one player who makes more than $30 million below the league average of 2,200 RPM. Generally speaking, if you want to make elite money, you need to have these high spin rates, and this plot sort of shows that intuitively. Secondly, there's a much more clear positive relationship between age and compensation. You'll also notice that there's just this huge cluster of players making less than $10 million over here. That's represented by young players because of service time, and we will talk about why it's maybe both efficient and problematic that it did not include service time in the model itself. So here's my total model. This is going to be a panel fixed effects model. I did log because I have so many different units of measurement, for one, that it's nice to just be able to look at a percentage change by percentage change. And also because what I'm really looking at is elasticities. I'm actually trying to determine everything's pull on salary and how these things affect each other. So here, some of these metrics, might be a little confusing if I don't go over them. So there's expected batting average, which is basically how hard you hit the ball and at what launch angle determines how many times it should be a hit. Then there's actual batting average in my beta 5. There's slugging percentage and expected slugging percentage, which is the same deal, just with how much power. There's on base percentage and expected on base percentage. Then there's fastball spin rate, strikeout percentage, walk percentage, And then here we have something really important, which is an interaction term between strikeout and spin rate. The reason I did it this way is because there is basically laboratory evidence to indicate that the higher a ball's backspin rate is, the further away it is on average from a barrel. So what I essentially did is I split these metrics into observed and predictive. Observed being what actually happened, predictive being what Trackman says should have happened, I guess is probably a good way to describe it. And so with this interaction here, strikeout percentage is what actually happened. Spin rate might actually be what should happen as it relates to strikeouts. And then, of course, I have my error term, and then various null hypotheses. I'm going to revisit these later, but basically the first three are saying that I think that beta 2 and beta 5 are related to expected batting after batting average. They're saying that I think that expected batting average will have a larger pull on salary than real. Same thing with slugging, where expected has a larger pull than real slugging, and same thing with on-base percentage. The beta 8 hypothesis says that I think spin rate will be statistically significantly impactful and related to wages, and the beta 11 coefficient says that I think that the interaction term will be negative because I think that spin rate is more statistically significantly impactful than strikeout percentage on my wages. So here we're going to go over to the regression output, and we're going to actually see the results of the study. So there are some things to talk about here. You'll see how statistically significant age is. There is some omitted variable bias here in service time because I didn't include service time in it. Service time is a Z variable that impacts both age and wages. So age is actually overstated. The statistical significance is overstated and the coefficient is overstated. If I had to do the study again, I would absolutely include service time in there. It's really hard to format into a data set. So the way that service time works is within the first 6 years of a player's career, their salaries are artificially suppressed. That obviously relates to age. That obviously relates to wages. On-base percentage is super interesting because on-base and expected on-base percentage are both statistically significant, which aligns with what we learned in John Hakes and Raymond Sauer's Moneyball hypothesis paper. Those effects seem to still be pervading into today's game. What is a little weird is expected on-base percentage's positive coefficient. That would indicate that as pitchers allow people to get on base more, they also get paid more, which doesn't make sense logically, and we will talk about why I am sort of able to push back against that later on. The things I really want to focus on are actually these two bottom variables here, which are four-seam spin rate and the spin to strikeout ratio. Four-seam spin rate, for every percentage change from the mean of spin rate, it is accompanied by, a pretty statistically significantly impactful increase in compensation. And then the spin to strikeout ratio, because that's positive, that actually means that strikeouts are still valued more than the spin rate, but the spin rate still matters on its own as indicated by the independent variable. It just means that strikeouts matter as well. So there are some there was a problem with heteroskedasticity within the model. I conducted a lot of sort of validity tests here especially because that on-base percentage thing didn't make a whole lot of logical sense. The heteroskedasticity present within the fixed effects model had a p-value of 0.0112, which does reject the null hypothesis and means that there are non-constant standard errors within certain variables. So what I did is I pinpointed the problematic variables. You will not be surprised to learn that they are on-base percentage and expected on-base percentage. I conducted White's robust covariance matrix estimator. Got the homoscedastic standard error for both on-base percentage and expected on-base percentage, and discovered that these standard errors are actually larger than they were in the original model when corrected for as homoscedastic. This is interesting primarily because I'm actually just going to go right on back to it. You'll notice that the coefficients are really small, especially when talking about tens of millions of dollars. They are very close to zero. The standard error for expected on-base percentage was larger than the coefficient is. So what I mean by that is within its own standard error, it could have flipped to negative. So the statistical significance is important. It's tough to gauge Whether or not they're actually negative or positive, however, because the standard errors are so large and the coefficients are so small. Logically, we would expect for them both to be negative, so I will just sort of assert that right there. There is no evidence of autocorrelation within my model. I conducted a Bush-Godfrey test, has a p-value of 0.8894, which fails to reject the null hypothesis. That also just sort of aligns with what I thought would be true. Past labor has limited to no impact on future labor. There's far too much variance in the game for that to actually, to be true. And also, it's a fixed effects model, so a lot of that variance is controlled for in the error term. So yeah. So implications for this model is that these expected batted ball profiles don't really have a significant relationship with pitcher compensation. Expected batting average, expected slugging percentage, they didn't seem to matter too much. I have various reasons why that might be true. Spin rate, however, is a statistically significant determination of compensation. It could help explain some of this gap between marginal product of revenue and wages, leading to competitive balance within the last decade or so. And actually, if I can go back to the expected batted ball profiles just for a second, I expect the reason why that's the case is because it's not entirely dependent on the pitcher. If the hitter is just super good, then they're going to hit the ball, regardless of how good the pitcher is. And so it might be that employers are more willing to compensate for things that they know they can completely control. So, I mean, you know what somebody's spin rate is, you don't necessarily know how somebody is going to hit him. So spin rate is a statistically significant determinant of compensation. So that leads to the question, I mean, how can any of these economists study monopsony within this industry without the most accurate variables that represent what employers actually value? All of these studies were conducted before Trackman technology was ever even implemented, so none of them have spin rate in them, and they absolutely should moving forward, because if we're going to try and determine whether or not players are being paid fairly, we should, use the variables with which they're being paid for. The last thing is that I was trying to see whether I could identify a year in which this changed, where I could go, wow, this is super rapid. Look, from 2015 to 2016, everything changed. That wasn't here. I was unable to pinpoint this Moneyball-esque tipping point where valuation changed. That is almost certainly because it happened within the first 4 years where I had no data, because these variables are valued. They only existed from 2011 to now, and they didn't change at any point from 2015 to 2019. So, I mean, it could be true that the employers just sort of knew already from their laboratory spin rate stuff that it mattered. I think it's more likely that from 2011 to 2015, where I have no data, they found that spin rate matters and then corrected for it. This is also just as a fan of the game, I know that it was being talked about at that point in time for the first time, and there's some sort of inside knowledge there. So next steps, also this could also be titled if I had to do the study again. So one potential problem with this study is that it assumes all player labor is valued in a vacuum. This is clean, it eases interpretation. I removed everybody's names, I basically turned them all into numbers. That's maybe not the best thing to do, because there is a human element to the game, of course. If some player has a particularly strong work ethic or he gets along really well with other players, he might be paid for that as well. So what might actually have been a better strategy to do would be to assign an ID number to each player and then follow them through time like that. But that's not actually what I did. Service time, I've talked about already. It's an omitted Z variable related to both age and wages. It should absolutely be controlled for in future iterations of the model. It is really tough to format. I can't stress that enough, how to format service time into an Excel document. Separating independent variables into talent and results categories might actually lead to more clarity than expected and observed. This is sort of another hypothesis that I would test in the future. I would want to include velocity, spin rate, vertical movement, horizontal movement, just these talent variables that don't change for pitchers, that are sort of empirical evidence of their ability to throw a ball in a way that other people can't. And then results categories are, well, how much does it get hit? Because my new hypothesis from this model would basically be that employers are more willing to compensate for talent than they are for past success. So yeah, that's basically all I got.
Nice, good.
Yeah.
Going on service time, you said that players, for like the first 6 years of their career, that their wages are suppressed.
Yes.
Is that due to like their